No one expected this. A policy meant to make America stronger has triggered the opposite. What started as a trade maneuver quickly snowballed into a full-scale economic backlash. Prices are rising, factories are pausing, and long-standing allies are quietly turning their backs. The blowback from tariffs is no longer hypothetical, it's happening now. When the Trump administration imposed sweeping tariffs under the banner of America First, the initial headlines were filled with patriotic slogans and bold promises. The tariffs, aimed at steel, aluminum, automotive parts, and agricultural goods, were supposed to reinvigorate domestic industry, protect American jobs, and punish foreign competitors. But within months, cracks began to form. American manufacturers relying on foreign components saw costs spike. Small businesses, unable to absorb the price hikes, passed them on to consumers or shut down. Construction firms reported delays due to shortages of steel and concrete. Even basic grocery items, from canned goods to bread, began creeping upward in price. The average household started feeling the pinch, and no one could quite explain why. In Canada, the response was swift but understated. Prime Minister Trudeau didn't deliver fiery speeches. He didn't threaten retaliation on social media. Instead, Canada made one quiet but devastating move. They walked away. Negotiations stalled. Bilateral deals were frozen. And in a strategic pivot, Canada began strengthening ties elsewhere, particularly with the European Union and Asian markets. Then came the real blow. Canadian exporters, once heavily tied to the U.S., started rerouting supply chains. Steel that once crossed the border daily was redirected to European shipyards. Agricultural goods found new buyers in Asia. And high-value manufacturing, especially in auto parts, shifted toward domestic use or non-U.S. destinations. The economic umbilical cord was quietly cut. Back in Washington, officials brushed off the warning signs. Treasury spokespeople insisted the tariffs were working. Short-term pain for long-term gain, they said. But the numbers told a different story. Within one fiscal quarter, American steel plants had only regained a fraction of lost output, but at the cost of rising prices across construction and transport. American car manufacturers faced production slowdowns due to shortages of Canadian parts. Farmers in the Midwest, who once relied on Canadian fertilizer and equipment, now faced supply gaps and inflated costs. And most visibly, prices surged. At first, it was subtle, a few cents more for milk, slightly higher prices on meat. But by spring, inflation had accelerated. Core goods rose 1.3% month over month, a pace not seen since the 1970s. Even discount chains raised prices. Public support for tariffs began to wane. Farmers, a key Trump voting bloc, voiced frustration. "We were promised protection," one Iowa farmer said. "Instead, we're being priced out." Across towns and small cities, factories faced new uncertainties. Contracts were canceled. Workers furloughed. And business confidence quietly eroded. But the White House remained defiant. President Trump doubled down. "We don't need Canada," he declared at a rally. "We're bringing the jobs home." Yet behind the curtain, advisors scrambled. The Canadian withdrawal was more complete than expected. And the inflation numbers were too big to ignore. By then, the damage had already begun. The tariff war wasn't a slow burn anymore, it was a spark near dry tinder. While the public was still trying to understand what had gone wrong, Canada accelerated its departure from the US-centric trade orbit. It wasn't just about protecting their economy, it was about creating a new one. A new trade paradigm was forming, quietly and deliberately, and the United States was no longer at the center. Canadian officials began meeting with European and Asian counterparts more frequently. Memorandums of understanding were signed. Joint investment projects launched. A new rail corridor from Vancouver to Prince Rupert received fast-track approval, with its purpose clear: to reroute Canadian exports away from U.S. ports and directly to Asia. For decades, the U.S. had acted as the hub of North American logistics, a gateway for trade between continents. But now, that role was being challenged, not with confrontation, but with quiet infrastructure. More ports, more rails, and more autonomy. Canada wasn't just walking away from trade with the U.S., it was building alternatives. And then came the domino effect. Mexico, sensing the vulnerability of U.S. supply chains, intensified its own economic shift. New partnerships with South Korea and Germany were announced. The once harmonized North American supply triangle, U.S., Canada, Mexico, was coming undone. Meanwhile, the American public faced the fallout. Prices didn't just rise, they destabilized. A gallon of milk that cost $3.29 one week could jump to $3.89 the next. Construction firms halted projects because imported metal components were stuck in customs, held up by retaliatory inspections, or missing altogether due to newly applied tariffs. Trucking companies laid off drivers. Manufacturers turned to automation not for innovation, but out of desperation. But the scariest part was the shift in perception. Internationally, the United States was no longer seen as a stable, predictable trade partner. And in global commerce, predictability is power. When Canada walked away, the message wasn't just economic, it was psychological. It said, "We can thrive without you." And while Washington remained consumed with political drama, the real drama unfolded in silence, on loading docks, factory floors, shipping lanes. Quiet numbers on spreadsheets told the truth: output down, imports delayed, consumer confidence slipping. Investors began to ask difficult questions. Foreign companies reconsidered U.S. expansion. Some quietly paused hiring. Others pulled out altogether. Even American corporations moved capital abroad, hedging against a future where global trade simply worked better without Washington's interference. Canada, once the junior partner in NAFTA, now stood with leverage. It had built redundancy, options, and distance. America, in contrast, was stuck with a shrinking circle and swelling prices. And still, officials repeated the same line: the tariffs are working. But the question no one wanted to answer was, working for whom? Because for the millions of Americans who now paid more at the pump, saw groceries climb, and feared pink slips, the tariffs weren't a tool of protection. They were a slow, grinding weight. One that pressed harder each day, while neighboring economies moved ahead, freer, faster, and increasingly without them. And as the supply chains of the future took form, with routes that bypassed American oversight, the uncomfortable truth settled in. The world was adjusting, recalibrating, and learning to function in a reality where the U.S. was no longer the center. This isn't speculation. This isn't warning. This is now. And this is only the beginning. As the new trade routes solidified and prices continued to rise, a deeper fracture was forming inside the United States, not between political parties, but between economic classes. For large corporations with global reach, the tariffs were a challenge they could navigate. But for small and medium-sized businesses, the consequences were existential. A family-owned tool manufacturer in Ohio suddenly couldn't import the specialty steel it had relied on for decades. A furniture company in North Carolina faced delays for key parts made in Canada. Restaurants, grocery chains, and retailers all saw supplier contracts fall apart, not because of market shifts, but because the costs of crossing the border had become unpredictable, even hostile. What was once a seamless continent was now a patchwork of red tape, uncertainty, and fear. Canada, for its part, had made the transition. Its economy didn't just survive the rupture, it restructured. With new trade agreements, new ports, and domestic investments, Canada positioned itself as a stable gateway between Asia and the West. And with the US focused inward, many nations welcomed the shift. Then came the headlines that couldn't be ignored. Canadian GDP growth outpaces US for second quarter in a row. Global investors shift billions into Canadian markets amid US uncertainty. Mexico. Canada signed trade pact with EU, US not included. Washington tried to respond, not with policy, but with blame. Officials pointed fingers. At Kenyatta, at China, at internal critics. They repeated slogans. They promised manufacturing renaissances that never arrived. Meanwhile, the supply chain crisis morphed into something even more dangerous: loss of confidence. For decades, the US dollar wasn't just currency, it was trust. It represented consistency, rule of law, economic might. But tariffs, retaliations, and unilateral decisions chipped away at that image. And as trade partners found new options, the dollar's symbolic power began to erode. It wasn't a collapse, it was a migration. Bit by bit, capital, contracts, and confidence began flowing elsewhere. The impact wasn't confined to economics. It reshaped diplomacy. Where once Canada and the US stood shoulder to shoulder on global initiatives, there was now hesitation. Where trade summits once ended in consensus, now they ended in statements of divergence. And as global institutions watched America turn inward, they began planning for a different future, one with more players, more centers of gravity, and less dependency on Washington. Even American allies in Europe and the Pacific began crafting bilateral deals that intentionally bypassed the US. Resilience became the new buzzword, the idea that trade should withstand political shocks, including from Washington. The very country that built the modern trade system was now the risk factor others planned around. And still, the public in the US faced the immediate consequences. Groceries cost more. Rent climbed. Utility bills rose. But wages stayed flat. The middle class, once the engine of American growth, found itself squeezed from all sides. And no one could point to a single enemy. There was no war, no embargo, no blockade. Just policy and its unintended aftermath. A truck driver in Michigan put it simply: "They said they were protecting us, but I can't afford the protection." The blowback wasn't dramatic. It was slow, cumulative, and relentless. Not a bang, but a grind. Every week a little harder than the last. And all the while, America's former partners kept moving forward, together, and increasingly, without it. The final fracture came not with a speech or a bill, but with silence. The silence of longtime allies who no longer asked Washington for permission. The silence of international conferences where American seats remained empty or unattended. The silence of trade delegations rerouted through Ottawa, Berlin, or Seoul, bypassing DC entirely. It didn't happen overnight. But that was the most dangerous part. While attention stayed fixed on tweets, headlines, and partisan debates, the world evolved. Methodically, pragmatically, and without waiting. Foreign businesses stopped counting on American stability. Trade organizations began removing default US-centric models from planning documents. Even global shipping insurers, the quiet backbone of logistics, started factoring in tariff volatility as a permanent American risk. Domestically, the mood shifted from confusion to resignation. For many, especially in rural and industrial communities, the promises of renewed glory had turned to dust. Towns that once depended on cross-border commerce began shrinking. Warehouses emptied. Local lenders stopped offering small business loans. And yet the rhetoric from the top stayed the same: it's working. But no one could ignore the new reality. Canada, long considered the quiet neighbor, now led innovation in clean energy trade, digital logistics, and multinational supply coordination. It had signed climate-aligned trade pacts with Europe. It had opened new rail and maritime channels with Asia. And most importantly, it had done so without chaos. Meanwhile, the US faced internal contradictions it could no longer afford to ignore. It couldn't be isolationist and global at the same time. It couldn't raise walls and expect bridges. It couldn't threaten partners and expect loyalty. And now, with prices still climbing, with businesses fleeing, and with consumers paying more for less, even the most devoted defenders of the tariff strategy began to reconsider. Some quietly, others publicly. But the damage was done. And not just to markets, to trust. Trust from allies. Trust from investors. Trust from its own people. Because in the end, this wasn't just about Canada walking away. It was about a system breaking, a system where America led not just by size, but by reliability. That system had frayed. And now the question was no longer, can it be fixed? But, what replaces it? For Canada, Mexico, the EU, and Asia, the answer was already taking shape. Diversified trade lanes. Multipolar institutions. Distributed risk. And above all, independence. But for the United States, the answer remained elusive. The tariffs were supposed to be leverage. They became isolation. The surging prices were supposed to be temporary. They became a feature. The partners were supposed to return. They adapted instead. And so, what began as a strategy became a turning point. And this is only the beginning.